you toss and tumble on a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blues.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the. I don't know if you're seeing a very green screen or wherever you're seeing us, but welcome to It's Your Time.
It's your time you're wasting.
With me, David Didow, and
me, Martin Robinson.
And we've got a pretty interesting show this week, Martin.
Yes, we have. We've got Matt Hood, who's coming up in a minute live, who's going to talk to us about Oak National Academy.
And you've been interviewing the alter ego of Titania McGrath.
Well, Andrew Doyle, and he's going to talk about an article he wrote for the Mail on Sunday that caused a bit of consternation with various people on teacher Twitter, I believe.
I'll bet it did. And then we've also got an interview with Mark and Zoe Enzer, the Enzers, who are talking about their new book, Generative Learning in Action. I think that's part of Tom's stable, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. It's a John Catt publication, certainly.
It's a John Catt publication. And thank you very much for reminding us that the show is sponsored by John Catt Publications, and and we're part of their evil empire. And so we're also going to be talking a little bit about some stuff you've been reading, Martin, as we generally do, and we'll have a little bit of a COVID update because why not? But we're going to begin, I think, by talking about the curriculum, and that's really the focus of this episode, because we've got two quite different views probably on what it means to have a curriculum and to plan for a curriculum. And on that note, we'd like to welcome, he's currently in the green room, the virtual green room. We'd like to welcome Matt Hood, who is an ex-teacher, an ex-economics teacher, and who spent some time working for the DFE as an advisor, and is now, after doing some teacher training work, running Ambition and the Institute for Teaching, he's now the principal of Oak National Academy. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for being on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And obviously, you set up Oak in the heat of things, right back in sort of March, April, when schools were shutting, pupils were at home, teachers were at schools, didn't really know what to do, and along you came in your shining armour, riding your white horse. But what's Oak doing now that schools are reopened and children are back in school?
So I'm going to push you on your knight in shining armor. Certainly nothing of the sort, but a group of really hardworking teachers, about 40 in the first instance, who were in the kind of fortunate position of being able to provide good quality remote education to their pupils. The wonders of technology mean if you can provide it to 30 pupils of your own, you can provide it to 300,000. And this is like the culmination of a project and a piece of hard work from them. About halfway through the term, we had to make a decision about whether we were going to mothball the whole thing, close down, go home. Schools were going back and everything was fine, or answer this question about whether there was a continuing need or use for us, whether we could continue to be helpful. And the conclusion that we came to after speaking to a few hundred teachers and school leaders was actually the situation that we're seeing unfold now, with classes and year groups having to self-isolate if a pupil in a particular bubble is coughing or tested or whatever. These teachers and school leaders were anticipating this and said to us, if you can keep this open, that'd be great. With a couple of caveats. Caveat number one was, at the moment, you're releasing lessons week by week by week. We don't need them week by week by week. We need the whole lot in advance, everything, because our curriculum is different to your curriculum, and it'll only work if it's as flexible as possible. So we spent the summer setting out a version of a curriculum for 4 to 16-year-olds broadly comprehensive. It's not quite there yet, but it's pretty comprehensive, and got a bigger army, about 300 odd teachers to record every single one of the lessons that are in that curriculum, about 10,000 in total. About 3 weeks ago, we put that online and made it available to anybody that needs it. So if a class or a year group is sent home, we've tried to help sort of reduce the burden on teachers by giving them a set of remote resources, now downloadable in lots of cases as well, to use swiftly and effectively without kind of placing additional burdens on them.
Matt, that's really interesting points you've raised there about curriculum and connectivity with schools. What I'm interested in, and I think you've done a wonderful job. I mean, hats off to you and all the people involved. If all of a sudden a child gets a test result and that child has to go home, or the bubble has to go home, and you're putting in place some lessons there, how does that fit with what a school might be doing? Have you got just every lesson on anything under the sun that could possibly be there? Or should a school be perhaps modeling their curriculum more around the Oak model in order to deliver it? I mean, is this some sort of de facto national curriculum you're running, which is trying to shape everything around the Oak model?
Yeah, so definitely not the latter. Let's talk a little bit about the former. So what we've tried to do is create a curriculum that is largely based around the national curriculum and is as minimally esoteric as possible. So we've tried to identify what we think most people broadly teach to create a situation where the Oak curriculum is able to bend and flex to the individual school's curriculum. So we haven't set out, for example, where we don't think one is necessary because the subject discipline doesn't demand one. We haven't set out a particular hierarchy in lots of cases, for example. You know, it doesn't matter sometimes whether you teach Unit A, you then Unit B, or Unit B, then Unit A. And if that's the case, you know, we've not specified any order. We've tried to pick popular Shakespeare plays and popular books and things that most schools tend to use. And you know, schools are using this in a whole range of different ways, but one of the things that we're seeing is, you know, we published our curriculum in advance. The school takes a look at their own curriculum alongside ours and says, look, hey, here, yeah, we do geology with year 7s in geography. Yeah, it's normally about 8 to 10 lessons. We cover broadly this content. Oh, look, Oak's got a unit on geology. It's broadly 8 to 10 lessons. Great. If we're midway through the geology unit, this bubble goes home, or I need to cover the geology unit whilst the pupil's at home, I've got a backup ready. But I don't know of any situation, and I wouldn't encourage any situation where schools are wholesale using what it is that we've got. Like, this absolutely needs mediating by teachers and school leaders so that it's useful for them. We're just trying to make that process a little bit easier so that we don't have 450,000 teachers feeling that they need to record the geology unit over and over and over and over and again in their individual school.
No, that makes sense. That's really good. So, Matt, when you launched, you got no end of, obviously, extremely useful critical feedback on social media about all the things that you weren't doing, and instead of recognizing you for the incredible things that you were doing. But being wonderful people, you responded incredibly positively to that criticism. And I know that you've put a lot of work into trying to be more inclusive and to make the curriculum more diverse. Can you tell us a little bit about the efforts that you've gone to meet those needs?
Yeah, and look, like I think that the criticism's all fair cop, right? Like, we're public servants, we're spending public money, and like, people have got thoughts and opinions that we need to listen to and take really seriously. So like, that's just like part of the core. Like, you just have to get on with that. Like, what are the most useful bits of feedback we've had? So they range from like the really, really simple. So for example, when we first started, the teachers would say things like, good morning, year 2, welcome to this lesson on whatever. actually, some feedback that we got was, please can they just not say good morning year 2 at the start? Because actually this lesson, like we're using it for year 3s, and the year 3s are getting a bit upset when we say year 2, right? Like, an incredibly useful bit of feedback. We changed that immediately. Like, that's great. Through to the bigger questions, which is one of the things that I think you're driving at, which is like, if you're writing out a full curriculum, you have all of the responsibilities that any school has in choosing what to teach. And this is like amongst, I think, the most difficult and kind of sacred duties of teachers, right? We choose broadly what it is that is in the curriculum. And when you take the sort of sum total of human endeavors and try to boil that down even into 10,000 lessons, that's quite a lot of lessons, but the sum total of human endeavor does not fit into 10,000, unfortunately. So you've got to make choices, and what you choose kind of really matters. So like, what were our kind of guiding principles through that? And the first one was just like a really obvious one. I've mentioned it already, right? A whole bunch of schools, primarily primary schools, have a duty to follow the national curriculum. It's statutory. They can't choose to vary that. So if we're going to be useful to everybody, we need to broadly follow the national curriculum. A kind of non-compliant curriculum for us is a complete waste of time. So that's our starting point. But the national curriculum doesn't actually give you the level of detail, particularly in parts of Key Stage 3, that is necessary to get you down to the individual lesson level. It says stuff like, study some wartime poetry. Well, great. Like, which wartime poetry, right? We're not in the fortunate position of just being able to duck that question. If you're going to teach a lesson, you have to choose. And David Thomas, who's a head teacher in Norwich, was heading up our curriculum at this time and like led this piece of work, and I think did a really great job. So that, and there are a bunch of arguments, lots of which you and your viewers are familiar with, right? You can take the kind of Hirschian argument. This is about access to society. You need to choose those things that give people access. We had that in mind. You also have the kind of powerful knowledge, Michael Young argument here, like we've got to choose the knowledge that explains the world to the young people when they have it. And what does that look like? How do we select through that? But we also think there are some additional things that we had to, and it was important that we took into consideration. The first one is that I think the curriculum occasionally leads to misconceptions amongst the pupils who study it. Let me give you an example. You could go through a curriculum in a school in England, and you could end up with the misconception that those civilizations that were at the forefront of human endeavor were all white Western ones since the Egyptians, right? Like, you probably did the Egyptians at primary school, and beyond that, you could leave with that misconception. You could leave with the misconception that there weren't black people in England during Tudor times. You could probably leave school with that misconception as well. We just don't think that's good history, right? Like, Christine Counsell is excellent on this. Like, it's the job of a good historian to look at a wide range of sources and to not leave pupils with misconceptions about the past. And actually, there's loads of space in the national curriculum. It actually specifies other civilizations that aren't often as well covered. Kingdom of Benin, for example. We have a unit on the Mali Empire. These are like deliberately included in the curriculum, and they address really important misconceptions, as well as being just like fascinating pieces of history in their own right. Learning about the richest man that ever lived, like that's an important thing for pupils to know and understand.
Is that Mansa Musa?
It is Mansa Musa, yes. There's a great BBC podcast about him, which I'd recommend on a history podcast called You're Dead to Me. I love that podcast. I think it's a great listen in the car. So listen to the one on Mansa Musa. It's brilliant. There are two others, I think, that are important. Young talks about taking students beyond their experiences. And that is often interpreted, David's really good on this point, like that's often interpreted as taking them beyond their experiences related to disadvantage, right? Like, well, they haven't experienced all the things because they're from a low-income family and, haven't been to museums or traveled or seen all of these things. But, taking people on their experiences means a whole range of things. And I think it means like learning about other people, different cultures, different periods of history. And so we've tried to think about that. And then the other thing that we tried to think about is making sure that all pupils can see themselves in this curriculum. That's a matter of pride, and it's a matter of believing that people like you can do things like that. So our Key Stage 2 curriculum has a section on kind of notable or famous scientists. And, you know, it's really easy to end up with a list of white men on that list. And it's really easy to not include people like Katherine Johnson, who was the American NASA mathematician who was basically critical for making sure the really early space flights and moon landings were successful. So what we tried to do, we've just tried to be really thoughtful and really responsible. We've tried to think as hard as we can about these questions. And that doesn't mean throwing out the canon or Shakespeare or Canterbury Tales or any of those really important things that we think people should know. It just means thinking about how we spend 10,000 hours of time to make sure pupils leave with broadly the powerful knowledge that will help explain the world, that doesn't leave them with misconceptions and allows them to see themselves as becoming like those brilliant people who have, you know, created human civilization and endeavor and to add to the next stage of it. And you know, I get increasingly frustrated by shrieking and stone throwing from either sides of this debate, rather than actually the serious, sensible work that about 30 really talented heads of department did when they were trying to write this curriculum, you know, 10,000 lessons worth of human endeavor down in, you know, best part of the month during a national pandemic.
Yeah.
Matt, that was a very full answer and a very thoughtful answer. Thank you for that. Can I just ask you, as a follow-up to that, how do you approach British values? Do you call them British values? Are these values inherently British, or are they more than British values that we just happen to take on as our own, perhaps?
Yeah, so that is a really, really good question. And do you know what? I don't, one of the advantages of not actually being a real school is we're not subject to various statutory things that say we have to do things like explicitly teach that. I don't know if we have any lessons on that. It's a really great question. I've tried to get across as much of the 10,000 as possible, but there's about 1,000 different units. And so I'm certainly not enough in the detail. I did spend quite a lot of time with our citizenship curriculum, interestingly, which is again and sort of an area where you know, we need to be really thoughtful and careful about the units and the way in which those units are taught. And you know, the Association of Citizenship Teachers is, you know, really, really experienced at thinking about these questions. It's really easy to frame things politically without really noticing that you've done it. And again, these questions about what you choose to teach, not least British values, particularly pertinent over the past couple of weeks, is it's an interesting one. So honest answer, don't know. I'm going to dig into the curriculum and see if there's anywhere in it where we've actually addressed those. Maybe we haven't.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So we've got a question that one of our audience has asked you, and I think it's a good one, because there are, you know, clearly we're currently worried about where the pandemic's going, and some children are. I think you were saying to us earlier that you've seen just in the last week the number of people accessing your lessons has gone up, and the question that we've been asked on YouTube is this a mechanism, or is this part of an answer for a more blended approach? And I'll give you an example. A school I visited recently were using these kinds of lessons as cover. So a teacher was absent, and instead of doing a traditional cover lesson, they were watching the video. The teaching assistant paused the video at an appropriate time. The children were doing the work. Is that something, you know, is that sort of blended approach something that you hope or envision Oak being part of?
So one of the fascinating things about just creating something and putting it on the internet for the world to see and use is you get all of these really interesting use cases of people doing creative things with the resources that suit them. And we're really happy with however it is helpful for them to be used. And there are broadly, I think, three categories that we're seeing. The first one is the one that I've described, right? There's a situation where pupils need to be at home, and there needs to be some kind of sustained series of lessons over time. You know, and that can partly be because of COVID, but we've also had, I had an interesting conversation last week with the Association for Hospital Educators, I think is the title of the organisation. There are 12 hospital schools in England with pupils in there who are long-term unwell beyond COVID and have been for a long period of time. There are about 900 boys in the youth custody estate. They are mainly boys. So there's a whole lot of reasons why, in a particular circumstance, COVID being the primary one where this can be a helpful backup. Just to add here, I don't think there's any substitute for the teacher, right? The first and best option is to be in a classroom with your teacher. This is a second best, better than nothing alternative. The second use case is the one that you've described, which is like blending this with what the teacher's doing. We're seeing two main use cases there, one of which you've mentioned, which is cover. We've all been there. You wake up at 7 a.m, you've got an absolutely banging headache. You now need to set 5 lessons for some poor bugger to teach through the day. Can these be used? Can these be more helpful for a situation where you're going into a cover lesson? You don't have the necessary subject knowledge, but you're pretty good at running the room. And does that mean that those pupils get a more useful hour? The same applies for any internal exclusion rooms. What's happening in there? Could this be a way of improving? And then the final thing is catch up, right? Kid didn't quite get Pythagoras theorem. Don't worry, there's a maths teacher here. Again, you can go home and use that for your homework to try and grasp a concept that you might be finding particularly tricky. And then the third one that seems to be happening, again, partly because we've made about 70% of the resources downloadable now, is teachers are downloading them and adapting them. Some of them are using them as hard copies to send home, and some of them are using them in their classroom just as resources like teachers download all the time. So they're the 3 main ones. There's a fourth one that I think is happening occasionally, which is where trainee teachers aren't able to make it into schools at the moment because it's tricky. Their providers, I know some universities are doing this, are selecting lessons, then doing a group observation of the lesson and then debriefing it in the same way that they would normally. My background's in teacher training, as you know, and the thing that I think is particularly exciting about that is you can watch a teacher teach something that you're about to teach. That is more useful than watching a teacher of the same subject teach something random that you just happen to be around to watch, right? So you're teaching Pythagoras theorem next week. Don't worry, you can actually watch a teacher explain this. You can even take the transcript of the lesson and use it as a guide to help you explain it for the first time really well. So an interesting fourth one that's emerging.
Well, that's I hadn't even considered that. That does sound like a really powerful use of what you're doing, and I'm sure that people are going to come up with more and various interesting ways.
And if they do, I'd really love to know about it. Tell us how they're helpful. Tell us how they're not helpful. We'll change them and make them more or less helpful.
So this is
Matt. How do they get in touch with you?
I think my Twitter is underneath my name here, so you can just tweet me.
Okay. That's brilliant. So, it's really interesting that this was something put together as an emergency stopgap measure. But as you say, you've got 10,000 hours of material out there, and I imagine that's going to continue growing.
And so I think a bit of growth. There's a couple of subjects that we don't have included yet that advocates and associations for those subjects are rightly banging on our door and saying, why isn't this subject included? Right. I think the next thing for us to think really hard about is how we continuously improve what it is that we've got. How do we bring more geography teachers in to that unit on geology? How do we get them to take a look at it and suggest improvements or refinements? And then how do we re-record that sequence or series to make them even better? I think if this works, if it is created, curated, and improved by the widest possible group of people in the profession, and remains there if you need it, useful if you want to use it, with no obligation, and you can ignore it if you're happy and you've got what you need. That's
brilliant. Well, Matt, thank you so much for allowing us to waste your time on a Friday afternoon. It's been brilliant to talk to you, and I think what you're doing is an incredibly useful resource that may well prove to be useful in all sorts of interesting and surprising ways for many years to come. And I really hope that you continue to go through that process of iteration and improvement. But thanks a lot for coming in. If you've got ideas for Oak, you can tweet. You've heard Matt say, feel free to tweet him, and he'll listen. He'll act on that.
And last thing to say, David, is if there's any schools at the moment that are in those year group bubbles that have been sent home and they're struggling and they need any help with how to do that mapping process or what other schools have done, they should also tweet us. We're running weekly webinars for people if they need it, and we can be helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well,
Brilliant.
So Matt, Matt may hang around in the green room. He may not, but that was brilliant. And you know, I mean, I don't know about you, Martin, but I as soon as I heard about Oak, I obviously, like most people, I was at home and I volunteered my services. Obviously, they didn't want them because they had much better people than me. But it just astonished me how many people were cross that they were doing this work and sort of throwing around brickbats. And I think I saw somebody come up with, say, on Twitter this week that there were all sorts of people who had great ideas about what should have been done. They just didn't do any of those other things. And that Matt and the group of teachers at Oak did do them. And so, for better or worse, whether you love it or not, it's a resource and it's there and teachers can use it. And that certainly doesn't stop anybody else doing anything and contributing in their own way.
And there's also things like the BBC Bite Size, wasn't there? And all those things that are all out there. And the more material out there, the better, I should think.
I think that's perfectly sensible. The world's big enough. So it was really interesting to hear Matt talking about that question of diversity, because I thought that seemed to me a very proportionate, sensible approach. It makes complete sense that children need perhaps, a core of the most powerful, most important concepts, but they also need, I think, as Matt put it, to see themselves in the curriculum and to experience it in that way. And that for me, that felt like a very satisfactory answer, but probably it won't satisfy lots of other people. And as we know, that there has been increasingly over the last months, particularly, calls for schools to decolonize the curriculum, to replace perhaps things that we might see as canonical, as things which should be swept away and replaced with things which in some way represent a more diverse, more tolerant, more progressive society. And one of the things that's underpinned that is a body of thought that's packaged under the title of critical race theory. And the man that you have interviewed in the week, Andrew Doyle, was responding to the Chartered College of Teaching, putting together some training materials for teachers on critical race theory. Have I got that right, Martin?
Yes, and he's talking generally about the movements around Black Lives Matter and various other pressure groups and ideas that have taken on, I suppose, and looking at what's happening in America as well this morning with the Trump patriotic curriculum, an element of the culture wars. And Andrew Doyle wrote this piece in the Mail on Sunday about a viewpoint on it. And we're going to present part of the interview today, and then we'll put the full interview out next week. So if you want to catch the whole thing, make sure you subscribe to this channel.
Ah, very good. Okay, so I think we've got a little title, and then we'll play.
I mistrust this idea of telling children that everything about the world should be seen through the prism of race, gender, and sexuality, and that is what you are. You are part of a demographic. You are no more than that. You're not an individual with individual thoughts and feelings and ideas. It's basically the politics of identity. I think is bad for everyone, and I think it's particularly bad for kids. Okay,
now you talk about CRT, critical race theory. Can you just give me a brief idea what you mean or what they mean by critical race theory?
Yeah, critical race theory is an offshoot of of postmodernism. It's there's many branches of postmodern theories. Many of them don't even use the word postmodern. So there's some ambiguity about what that means, and it's very highly contested. But just to give a simplified version, it's branches such as queer theory, intersectional feminism, disability studies, fat studies. So basically identity groups, and it's a form of activism as well. So it's I suppose it's activism masquerading as academia. And that's what critical race theory is, another branch of this, which incorporates elements of intersectionality, which comes from Kimberly Crenshaw and writers like that, and is now propagated most famously by people like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility. I've noticed a number of schools in the UK tweeting about white fragility, which I would say is a very bad idea because it's one of the worst books I've ever read. I mean, it is utter bunkum. And the theory behind critical race theory is this idea that you can divide society into the oppressor and the oppressed. And this is based on a system known as whiteness. And whiteness is a kind of reinscribed original sin. It's the idea of it's an essential kind of evil, I suppose, to the extent that I mean, there was an article in America about two, I think, yes, it was Indian boys, I think, had attacked a black schoolgirl, and they were described as enacting whiteness. So any kind of evil act or action is deemed to be this supremacist, oppressive force. And what this does, of course, you know, as you'll have seen if you saw the TV show The School That Tried to End Racism, which is a Channel 4 show which you can still watch online, which is about a school that attempted to implement critical race theory, and it literally divided the class up into ethnic groups. It literally pushed onto the kids this idea that you need to see everything through your race. You should see white people as oppressors and complicit in white supremacy, even if they're toddlers, even if they're children, you know, this incredibly divisive idea. And the reason why I wrote the article is because I think we need to get back to the system that was working, and that is the liberal system. Now, it hasn't worked in all cases, and no one at all has ever suggested that racism no longer exists and isn't a problem that needs to be resolved. But the way that you resolve it is not through another racist system, which is critical race theory. You solve it through the principles of liberal values. And that's why it's very disturbing that it's infiltrated schools in this way.
That brings me to the next sort of question here, because if we're talking about a liberal system, if you like, then at the core of that is the idea of free speech, debate, looking at more than one side of the argument. So if that is the case, is it okay to teach critical race theory in context of lots of other theories that might also perhaps explain the way the world is or something?
The problem with critical race theory and theories like it is they don't stand up very well to scrutiny. So once you start talking about them and debating them, they fall apart pretty rapidly. And of course, that's why the proponents of these theories are so reluctant to have debates. They say that these things are beyond debate. You know, you'll have militant trans activists saying, I'm not going to have anyone debate my right to exist. That's not a proposition anyone has ever made, by the way. It's a rhetorical ploy in order to stop you having a sensible conversation about it. So it's the same with this. I would be fine. You can go into schools. I mean, it's not really appropriate for primary schools because they won't understand it. But you maybe sixth formers, you could talk about critical race theory, and you could have a discussion and debate about what its flaws are, what its good intentions are. I'm sure there are good intentions behind a lot of it. And within about 10, 15 minutes with intelligent kids, it will become immediately apparent how useless it is as a theory and how divisive it is, and actually how very dangerous it is when it's accepted without any kind of thought or scrutiny.
When it comes to teaching about racism, and you've touched on this a couple of times, and you're saying almost that Martin Luther King and that sort of old-fashioned idea of what racism is, you know, the content of character rather than the color of your skin, and judging people in that way. What sort of way do you think pupils are being taught to judge each other by now? Do you think there's a danger that this is becoming something that you imply is racist, but perhaps within a different sort of term? Perhaps it's against white people, or
well, it's racist against white people because it's based on the assumption that they are evil and wrong. It is racist against people of color because it implies that they will always be oppressed no matter what they do. Anything they achieve, they're not going to be able to do anything. They need looking after. They need to be protected and patronized. So it's racist in all sorts of, in every conceivable way it is possible to be racist. So no, it's it's not a system that I think should be brought into schools to replace a liberal system. I don't see why it's helpful.
And the Chartered College of Teaching, you raised this issue in your article. You say they gave out some anti-racist materials that were based on critical race theory.
Yeah.
You objected to this in your article, and obviously from what you're saying, the reasons why. But do you think that they were perhaps distributed with the worst of intentions or the best of intentions?
I think a lot of the time this is all well-intentioned by people who haven't read the theories and don't understand the theories, because it's couched in language that sounds so appealing. So the phrase that they will often use is anti-racism, and you've seen the other week, RADA, the dramatic school in London, students have just petitioned for them to introduce an active anti-racist policy across the board. If you read the 100-page document of demands from the students, it is genuinely unhinged. It's an absolute tract of lunacy. But if you just say the phrase anti-racist, well, you know, we're all opposed to racism, so it sounds wonderful. It sounds like a really good thing. Actually, what anti-racism does is it assumes that in any given situation, and this goes for critical race theory as well, in any given situation, racism exists. In any human interaction, racism exists. So the question isn't, is this a racist interaction or word or dialogue or whatever? The question is, how did racism manifest itself in this situation? That is actually, my ancestors were colonized, you know, because they were Irish. So, you know, who are you talking about? It's again, this collectivized thought and not thinking in terms of individuals. So no, I don't. I mean, decolonize it. Look, there have been many years people have had debates about what should be in the canon, what shouldn't be in the canon, how do these things get formed? And you mentioned it yourself, the word perspectives. I think, obviously, seeing a range of perspectives is a really interesting idea. Perspectives are not tied to race, gender, and sexuality specifically, because one gay black man could have a completely different worldview from another gay black man. So this doesn't make any sense to think, well, if we have more black voices on the curriculum, it's going to diversify the. Well, it might not. You might just get everyone saying the same thing. Just people have different color skin. You know, the focus shouldn't be on skin color or sexuality or anything else. The focus should be on the quality of the literature and the importance of the work in terms of the historical canon. The canon isn't just formed arbitrarily by oppressors. As Sheffield University said recently, the only reason why we're teaching Shakespeare and Chaucer is because they're white males. I mean, these are utterly absurd and historically illiterate. It's just Philistinism. That's not the reason why. The reason why is the impact, that it has a kind of cascading impact on literature and the arts that you can see. There's a reason why artists have mimicked and borrowed from the great artists of the past, Da Vinci, Michelangelo, whatever. They've taken these, they've been influenced. And the reason is that they have some kind of grounding, a natural grounding within the canon, which comes from being geniuses that inspire. So it isn't the case that a group of oppressive straight white men got together and said, right, we're only going to teach other straight white men to perpetuate this oppression. That's just as I say, a completely ignorant point of view. It's not how things work.
Is something only canonical due to time, or can something jump into the canon, you know, straight off the stage? Literally, so
I mean, rarely. I don't. If I'm going to read a novel and I want it to be good, I'll make sure it's at least 60 years old. But that's because there's, you know, I don't trust modern novels. You know, I think the standards of literature have declined generally. And art generally, but there are some brilliant modern novelists. I love Kazuo Ishiguro. I love Salman Rushdie. But you know, those are probably the only two that I would go out of my way to buy their new books. But having and certainly, I think studying modern literature is a good thing, and yeah, fantastic. But I wouldn't be so arrogant as to assume that my taste now will become canonical. How could I possibly do that? I don't know how many generations of artists or writers Rushdie and Ishiguro have or will influence. They have certainly in the present day influenced an awful number of people, and I absolutely adore their work. But maybe in 5 or 6 generations' time, their work won't be considered consequential at all. I don't know. I don't have foresight. That's the point. The canon isn't just about taste, really. It's about something much more than that. Well, it is about taste, but it's about taste collectively from artists and creators and influences and that kind of thing. These things don't happen by accident.
But was there some argument of saying that the taste has been distorted over time by the gatekeepers who actually have made sure that the canon reflects a very narrow view of society, perhaps?
I just don't see that as being an authentic point of view. And I think it's kind of a misunderstanding and a politicization of art. You know, I don't think that artists are in the business of sending the correct moral message. I'm very much of the same view as Oscar Wilde here, you know, where he writes in the preface to Dorian Gray about how there is no such thing as a moral book or an immoral book. Books are badly written or well written. That is all. You know, I'm paraphrasing there, but that's basically what he said. Yeah. So I think that's my view of art. Art is about a recreation of one's own view of the world, as Emile Zola put it, life seen through a temperament. It is a recreation. It is artifice. When the worst kind of art, I'm not saying art can't be political, but for me, the worst kind of art is when it is overly didactic. And I think it's a very reductive view of art and the history of art and literature to suggest that it is just about power play. It is just this was the problem with the whole post-structuralist, postmodern movement. Once you get into these kind of French theorists of the 1960s, it means that you end up reducing works of art and poetry to, well, you know, it's about the deconstructive system is about trying to tease out the contradictions, identify the secret prejudices, identify how the power structures work. You know, that means that this is why when Kate Millett wrote her book Sexual Politics in 1970, she's an American academic, I think. Is she American? I think so. Anyway, yeah. She wrote this god-awful book, which basically picks apart works like by, for instance, D.H. Lawrence. And we'll go through it and say where the misogyny lies in D.H. Lawrence. Well, I don't care if D.H. Lawrence was a misogynist. I don't think that I can necessarily determine that from his work anyway, which is something that these activists come critics think they can do. I don't think you can do that. But even if you could, I don't really care. I care about the quality of the work and the importance of the work and its literary significance. So I think this is a mistaken view of art and the canon generally, which needs to be redressed.
I have a feeling that the question you ask, which was famously asked last summer, I think, Stormzy or Mozart, you might be more in the Mozart camp than Stormzy, perhaps?
Obviously. I mean, it's a preposterous and ludicrous question to even pose, and it's also incredibly patronizing to Black children to suppose that they cannot possibly appreciate classical music. It's just racist.
Well, a great interview. Sorry for the sound quality in the middle of that. We will patch it up and correct it in post-production. And as Martin said, we will release the full interview separately. But again, you know, a really interesting, thoughtful position there, Martin.
Yes, it'll be good to hear perhaps if people would like to take him up on it, that perhaps someone could give an opposing point of view, perhaps in next week's episode. So do get in touch with us if you're interested in joining the debate. And I think this is my takeout from all these things is we need to offer debate in school rather than just say this is the way to think about things. Because if you are talking about gender or race or other things that are being presented as this is the truth, and yet it's contested, then we should get children into the conversation about the contestation itself, rather than I think I made the point in certainly the interview, the whole interview about a child who came back to their parents' house talking about there are 100 different genders and having an argument with their parents about it because their parents were objecting to it. And they said, no, it's true. The teacher told me. So, you know, perhaps we need to offer argument, dialectic.
Indeed. Absolutely. And, you know, that, you know, what my eldest daughter came home a while back and said, well, you know, the problem with your generation is that you're just all transphobic and racist. And, you know, that's not a great basis for having a discussion and all the rest of it. So
well, J.K. Rowling is a case in point about this. You know, there are children who coming back from school or whatever who now throwing out her books and all this, or objecting to them being taught in schools or being on the shelves in school libraries. I think it's just very few and far between, probably. It might be blown out of all proportion, but there's certainly rumors about it online.
Yeah, well, yes, there are. There definitely are. Well, that's a great point, Martin. If you would like to give a rebuttal to Andrew Doyle's point of view, by the way, in case you didn't know, Andrew Doyle is the voice of Titania McGrath on Twitter. If you've ever followed that, what do you call it? Avatar or something like that.
Satirical account.
Satirical account. That's what it is. If you'd like to make a rebuttal or a counter argument, we would love to interview you and to air that contrasting point of view. But it's now time to do a COVID update.
Yeah. Well, what a surprise. Children go back to school and the numbers go up.
Yes. Who could have called it?
No surprise at all, I suppose. But it's really interesting, of course, that there are now problems in testing centres. And if you look, I was watching today on the news, and there were queues outside testing centres. I think it was in Newcastle or somewhere. And there were parents with children, and it seemed to be parents and children, parents and children, parents and children all the way through. And I've got an interesting graph. Could you have graph number 1, please, to have a look at how things have changed recently? And if you look at this graph, and the green is age 0 to 18, and this is the triage. So people calling 111, 999, and going online for 111. And you can see the number of concerns all of a sudden that there are for children aged 0 to 19, and the increase of them using these facilities, or probably their parents. And as a parent myself, I got a letter from, well, an email from the health office asking, encouraging everyone to attend school because they're increasingly concerned about lost learning. But if you are confident that any ailments your child has is no more than a standard cold that you would not normally keep your child off for, then do please send them in. So I think to some extent people are getting worried that people are taking kids off school, or worried that the slightest cough or the slightest sneeze might be COVID, rather than it not being, perhaps.
That's a good point. And in fact, Tim Spector was talking on Radio 4 this morning saying that if you are sneezing, you definitely haven't got COVID. That's one of the big contraindicated symptoms. So, this time of year, especially going back to school, children are going to get colds. That's inevitable. Whether or not they've got colds, certainly, well, it would, maybe one assumption we could make is that they're less likely to actually have COVID. Can we?
Is that good enough though? Because they say also that children get very mild symptoms if nothing at all. So one slight temperature or one slight cough, and you might think, well, hang on, could it be? So of course you want to go along and get a test to prove one way or the other, and there you can't get a test.
Well, I mean, then that is obviously that's a big picture. One interesting perspective that was in the TES this week from a pediatric epidemiologist called Sunil Bhopal, and he says, and I'm quoting here, he says he's aghast to hear that for medical and public health reasons, whole year groups, sometimes hundreds of pupils, are being sent home from their schools when a single child tests positive. And which is, so that's really interesting to hear that he's so aghast. And he says, as a pediatrician, the sorts of questions that he needs to ask, or that we need to ask, is what does a proportionate response to different types and severity of a COVID school outbreak look like? So that's one. Then we need to think about the government guidance. Then we need to think about the interpretation by schools and local health teams. And finally, we need to think whether the guidance that's out there needs to be amended for greater clarity and consistency. And one of the bits that he sort of particularly leaps on is the definition of close contact. And so, obviously children are separated into bubbles at school. And he's saying, the point he makes is that close contact means, touching, being really close contact. Doesn't mean necessarily being in the same year group as somebody that you haven't spoken to at all. There's little reason to think, in his view, that is a good definition of close contact. And he also makes the point, which is interesting, that a positive test doesn't mean that you're infectious, that apparently dead fragments of the virus sit around and picked up by tests. So his message is schools really need to be proportionate. Now, this isn't to say schools are not being, but is the guidance clear enough? And, but basically that where in a school that an infectious child hasn't come into contact with all 200 pupils in the bubble, then his message is exercise caution and keep educating.
When the app comes out, I think next week in England, I think it's already out in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and perhaps it'll be out in Wales at the same time as England. I wonder if it's going to be able to pick up sensitively any contact within school, and would that mean mobile phones allowed in schools? That would be another thing as well.
Yeah, a tricky one. Yes. So it's a complicated situation. And it's fast moving. Did you want to talk? We've got a second graph, haven't we, Martin? Do you want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, just to put that first graph into context. Look how the triaging was going on at the beginning of the pandemic, and look at the difference now. So to put it into some context, we're certainly not where we were yet. No. But I do think it's important for everyone to think very carefully about their kids. But of course, speaking as someone, the older you get, the more at risk you are. So actually, perhaps you're not protecting your kids so much as parents looking after themselves, and that should be part of the problem as well.
And this is something that's come out a few times, sort of thinking about your own sort of risk profiles. And if you've got a vulnerable family member living with you, then maybe you need to be making very different decisions for a family where that's not the case.
And of course, if you're a teacher who's
absolutely, and schools really need to work hard to keep their more vulnerable members of staff safe and healthy and protected. I'm sure they are, but that's obviously a concern. And I think the schools I've visited since the beginning of September, it appears to be a lot of choice, so that some staff are choosing to wear masks or visors and some staff choosing not to, and there's a lot of there's a lot of autonomy around those kinds of decisions, and I think that sounds right to me.
Anyhow, you're going back to school yourself, aren't you? Are you going to visit and teach again? What's occurring?
Yeah, from next week, I will be getting my hands dirty in classrooms as a classroom teacher for the first time in 8 years. I'm probably going to be rubbish, and it's going to be a humiliating fall from grace. Anyway, now we've got an interview with Mark and Zoe Enzer talking about generative learning. You just saw that come up on the old-fashioned TV. Let's cut to that interview. Well, I'm so excited to welcome Twitter's first couple, the Enzers, Mark and Zoe Enzer, to It's Your Time You're Wasting. Hello, both. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And is that a copy of Generative Learning I noticed perched between you?
It is.
Fantastic. So congratulations on the new book. It's published by John Catt, and it's available now. And if you haven't already got it, you should get it. But it's one of the first question I'd like to ask you both is what was it like as husband and wife writing this book together?
Actually, I thought it could be a little bit spiky. I thought there might be some moments where we could have some disagreement. But what we did was we were quite systematic in how we split it up. So we thought about the different areas, generative learning and the work of Logan Farella and Richard Meyer is very clear with the 8 strategies. So that was nice and straightforward, and we kind of divided those areas up. And at the beginning, we kind of looked in the introduction and the conclusion and said, which are the areas that we're particularly knowledgeable and passionate about? And then we wrote them, and then we fed into that and kind of went back and forth around it. But actually, where I thought there was going to be perhaps some tensions to arise, there weren't. So that was really good from my perspective. But Mark might be about to say something else.
I think once we spent quite a lot of time walking the dog and kind of discussing what the paper was saying and what its implications were, and the kind of the rest of the theory that it linked to. So we spent ages batting it around, and then we just divided it in two and said, okay, we've got a common understanding of what this is saying. Now let's divide up the strategies and see what we come up with.
Okay, so you each took the lead on 4.
Yeah.
Ah, okay. And it would be interesting for readers to see if they can tell. I could certainly tell at times, Zoe, your voice came through because you use I and referred to English, and I was like, well, that's obviously Zoe. And and anything to do with geography, I obviously knew that was to do with you, Mark. But other than that, it seemed a very consistent style. And how much work went into making it that consistent style?
We sat down, we agreed how we wanted to set out each chapter. So we used kind of, common headings throughout, because we wanted this to be a really easy guide for teachers to pick up and use and do something with, reflect in terms of their own practice and then take it away and do. So we made sure it had that kind of common style. And then I think we spent so long discussing each chapter, going backwards and forwards to each other. I'd write at the table, so we'd write on the sofa, so in the same room. We say, what do you think about this? Have you got an idea for this? I'm a bit, stuck on this. Right. And so the chapters kind of evolve together anyway a lot of the time. Right.
I think it's interesting you say that, you can hear my voice and you can hear Mark's voice. But sometimes I would say I could really do with a geography example here for this chapter. So people can play that game. And I know certainly somebody on Twitter over the weekend was throwing that exact idea out about the different writing styles that we may have. And I put that challenge there. Can you spot me? And can you spot Mark when you read the book?
Right. Well, so there's if obviously I'm sure that if anyone can get it absolutely right, get in touch with John Catt and they'll give you a prize.
I'm sure they will. A mug with our face on or something.
Wonderful. Yeah, what a lovely thing to own. Okay, so what the other questions? The other big question about the sort of writing of the book is obviously. Well, I would say obviously. To what extent was Tom involved as series editor?
Yeah, that's a good question. Tom, what are you doing? I think he was very good. He had, once the initial ideas were kind of discussed and kind of batting around some ideas, he did give a very good kind of hands-off approach and was very clear this is our book. And for each of the writers in the series said this needs to be your distinctive book. We've asked you to write it for a reason. And then afterwards, we sent the manuscript. He came out with some suggestions and ideas, which were fantastic, using his kind of experience of writing like this before. We then kind of fed into the final edit. But during the writing process itself, refreshingly hands-off.
But I do think it's fair to say that, he kind of had the parameters, but he allowed us that freedom within there. He wanted our own voices for everybody who's involved in the series to really come through, particularly when it came to practice, because as we know that's with the different subject areas, there's going to be a variety there.
Yeah, and what was it like? At what stage did Oliver get involved? Did he provide the drawings afterwards, or did you request things?
So the images we used were ones that he's already produced. So they're things on Ollie Cab's website. He's got a massive resource there for teachers to use and kind of take from. So we selected images there, and then after the manuscript was written, he did the kind of the page layouts, the designs, the covers, and kind of and everything there. But the images were ones that he had used that we felt illustrated the points we were making.
Yeah, it's definitely worth. He's got the poster rather like you would recognise from the Rosenshine. He's got that version for the generative learning, so kind of a one-page kind of stop for people to have a look at those different images and some of the key ideas from it, particularly in terms of research base.
Yeah, he's. Obviously, one of the so many. I suppose. This is right up Oliver's street, isn't it? Because it's the practice of what he does. He summarises, he illustrates, he. I can't remember the others off the top of my head, but he's doing.
The first time I came across generative learning, I think was a tweet from his a few years ago recommending their work. So it's certainly something that I think he'd had an interest in before.
And I think the concept mapping in particular, he's really unpicking that further and exploring that further himself.
Right. Okay. So one of the questions I have for you, 8 strategies, and I love the way that you right up front, you're really clear about the research base and you talk about boundary conditions, which is a really nice touch and not one that we're necessarily used to in education. Which, make a question to both of you, which of the 8 techniques is your favorite, if there is such a thing? Which one do you like the most?
Go on.
Self-testing. Absolutely self-testing. But of course, self-testing can be a feature of so many other of the strategies. But we know the power of retrieval practice. We know the power of kind of space practice and all of those things that come with that kind of self-testing. That's definitely something I'm a big fan of and see the power of within the classroom. And that's what it's about. It's actually knowing it's having an impact.
Okay, and so before we get on to Mark and talk about yours, one of the things you talk about in the self-testing chapter is you're a little bit critical of multiple choice questions. Can you say a little bit about that?
I think, like anything, it's how you make sure that you're using them effectively. And I think a really good, well-designed multiple choice question can yield a lot. And actually, I'm quite a convert for them for English. I don't think they have been something that have been used regularly in English. And I know some people think, well, they don't have their place. Actually, I think they do. And I've certainly used them and seen some really interesting and surprising results. And we know that any kind of assessment, that's really important, that you actually see something new that you perhaps didn't know. And so I've used them in various ways. The problem is if you don't actually plan them carefully and there are errors in there, they don't yield that kind of information. And so it's about that careful design. But I think that's true of any kind of assessment that you do.
Is it also, I mean, using them for an assessment, like you said, they work really well, but using them as a generative process, you're using the tool for slightly the wrong thing, perhaps. They're great for an assessment tool, but are they generating learning? Because the pupil doesn't have to go through the process of attempting to select the right information because it's right there.
They can. They can. Again, if you have a well-designed multiple choice question, they actually have to make that selection, particularly if they're having to decide between 2 very close options on there, and they're having to select.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because maybe many people designing multiple choice questions are not thinking about it in terms of generative properties, and so that now that you've said it, I almost think that's something that could be made a bit more of, because you raise the caution, and I hadn't really considered that purpose, and it should always be purpose comes first, doesn't it? That what are you trying to achieve? And then put the correct tool in. Okay, so Mark, what's your favourite?
I think mapping for geography is just not just drawing maps, but concept maps, graphic organisers are just an incredibly useful tool. So today my year 12 class were doing kind of a big concept maps around the water cycle, and they were able to show then the links between them. They were drawing on prior knowledge about the carbon cycle to show where there was overlap. Because geography is about making sense of the world, and that's what a concept map does. It organises and structures a diverse amount of information. So for geography, I think mapping is a very, very powerful tool, but probably less so in other subjects.
Can I
Go on.
just come back to your point that you made there, David, though, where you said about the purpose? And I think that is absolutely imperative when you're doing this, when you use any of these strategies. And none of these strategies are things that people can go, wow, I didn't realize summarizing existed. And, what's this about self-explaining? How do we ever use that? It's the purpose. And that's the big difference with generative learning.
Right.
We can use those things for many, many different reasons. But if we want it to actually follow the generative learning purpose and the science of learning that underpins that, then actually we need to kind of select what we're doing and why we're doing it, and making sure we're using the right thing at the right time. Concept mapping in English, I really struggle with, but I'm sure there are people out there doing wonderful things with it.
Yeah, and you do make the point, that these things fit better in different subjects than others, and I think that's a really important point to make. What would you say to someone who's like only experience of mind mapping is the Tony Bazan's type style of what's different from the generative learning approach?
So with all the generative learning strategies, it's around the SOI model that Richard Meyer came up with. So he said for learning to be generative, the pupil has to go through the process of selecting information, organizing it, and integrating it into their prior knowledge. So when you're creating a mind map generatively, you're selecting information from a body, and then you're organizing it around different categories. So an example of kind of mind mapping done badly, you kind of read some information in a textbook, and as you're reading it, you're just copying out all the words you think are important in a circle around the heading, maybe with some colored gel pens and some bubble writing and things. And highlighters. That's what you see with bad mind mapping. Yeah. Whereas if you want to do it generatively, then you're thinking, okay, I'm reading some information on Typhoon Haiyan. How does a geographer approach this information? Well, they want to look at the cause, the effect, and the response. So we'll have a heading cause. Okay, so I'm looking at the causes, and then I want to think about, okay, which of those were physical causes and which things about the event were driven by human behavior. So now I want to categorize those off. Okay, now let me find the information that's relevant to that. Now what's my next category, and so on. So they're kind of constantly organizing that information, and then they're thinking, okay, what else do I know about this topic that I can now add on to my mind map that isn't on the information in front of me, but comes from my long-term memory, that comes from within my existing schema, that I can now try to link this to. So it's a much more structured way of going about it.
And there we have the ENSAs talking about their book, Generative Learning in Action, which is a book by John Catt, published by John Catt, and therefore will take part in our wonderful raffle that we do at the end of each show. And you can win a copy of that book by, well, you have to subscribe to our channel, and you get it put into a big hat. And where I've forgotten where the hat is.
Where's the hat?
Here, the hat.
Brilliant.
Okay, and we'll do it in a minute. So
I can't tell
David,
you.
did you
Go on, sorry.
I was going to just say, did you do a long interview with the ENSAs? Was that just part of it, or did you do was it a longer one?
Oh, we spoke for hours. It was great, and I've now. This is what you are in with a chance of winning. It's not as somebody mistakenly said earlier, genital learning in action. It is generative learning in action, and well worth your shillings. But also, as Martin said, subscribe and you could win a copy. But last week's guests, Claire Hill and Kat Howard, talked about their book Symbiosis. I can't tell you how much trouble that Martin goes to cut out the names of all of our hundreds and hundreds of subscribers and put them in his hat. So, Martin, drum roll, and exciting graphic. Oh, Samantha, don't forget the graphic. There we are. Martin, who have we got?
We definitely need some music for that.
We do.
I wish I should have put my glasses on.
You
there
should.
you go. I think, no, that's just that actually isn't a human being. Sorry about that. Right. We have Daniel Darp, D-A-R-P-E. Daniel Darp. I think that's how it's pronounced. Daniel, if I've pronounced it wrongly, I do apologize. Please send an email to us. We'll put the email address out later. And this one. So, well, I don't know if we should allow that. Carl Hendrick won a prize there, who's a fellow author, I think. So, he'll be pleased to get another book in the post. So, Carl, if you're listening, get in touch.
Carl Hendrick, one of the most reprehensible human beings on the planet. It's a shame that he's won. So I'm very disappointed about that. But Carl, do please get in touch if you've won, along with Daniel Darp. Right, well, that's it for another week. Next week, we're going to try going out a little bit later. We're thinking around 5:30, but we'll keep you updated. So please join us for that, where our big guest will be E.D. Hirsch. Bye.